Okay, today is Saturday, October 9th. We're here with Keith Hook of Bloomfield, Connecticut for part 2 of his interview. I am Mike Van Buren, the interviewer, and we have already discussed previously Keith's service in the South Pacific with the U.S. Army and about his meeting his wife in New Zealand and getting married in New Zealand. And we're now going to discuss his post-war life. And we're going to begin with Keith's return to the United States at the end of 1945. So Keith, why don't you tell us just a little bit about that, please?
Well, when I went to the Philippines, I became a part of the Marical Infantry Division. And Marical is the only unnumbered division in the American Army, or was. And it got its name and officially because a task force went down New Caledonia from the United States, which comprised of units like an artillery unit, coast artillery, coast guard, not coast guard, but coast artillery, infantry battalions from the Dakotas, and they were separate units. They combined them together and formed the Marical Infantry Division, which organizationally, it was the same as the 25th Infantry Division or any other regular division by 1945. And we were occupying Japan for several months, disarming the area we were given outside of Tokyo. And we had completed our job there, and they were getting into the more long-range occupation of Japan. They brought other troops and people in there, and they decided to disband the Marical so that it would no longer exist. It will cease to be a division.
How long were you in Japan total, would you say?
I was in Japan a total of about 3.5 months.
Okay. Did you have much, I assume you had some interaction with the civilian population?
Oh yes, I had as part of the G3, I had to travel around a lot to make arrangements for where our troops were quartered. For instance, a certain battalion would go to a certain area, and I'd be arranging that transportation with the railroad, the Japanese people, of their railroad personnel or others, and I got to know quite a few Japanese casually like that, and I also had an interpreter assigned to me because I couldn't speak Japanese, and the interpreter lived outside of Tokyo, or actually not too far from the Emperor's Palace, and it did not get bombed out. So when I used to go into the Daiichi building sometimes on Army business, but also sometimes trying to check out shipping and things to get my wife up to United States or get myself down to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. So I'd go to the Daiichi building frequently. I'd stop at his house, and I can give one incident of that. My experience there is that he had a wife and a daughter and a son. He was an ink manufacturer during the war.
This was a civilian Japanese?
He's a civilian Japanese who was assigned as interpreter to me because he knew English.
Okay.
And we got to his home, and we took our shoes off before we went into the house. In their living room, they had half of it Western style, and they had a piano in there. And then they had the other half of it Japanese style, where you'd go up on a couple steps and be in this second level where you'd sit down. There wouldn't be chairs to sit on and so forth. It would be a regular place where they live, I believe. And they that morning when we came and stopped by his house, I thought it was kind of bad of him not to shave, and I should really say something to him about it, but I didn't do it. But as soon as we got to the house and his wife saw he was shaving, she whisked him away, and the next thing I know, he came back shaved. Also, while he was absent, they had their son and daughters were both teenagers. The son came in to talk to me, and his English wasn't very good, but their daughter's English was better. But according to Japanese custom, she would not be allowed in a room with me, a stranger, and that sort of thing. And so when the son was trying to talk to me and we'd be carrying on a conversation, she stood in the doorway, not hiding or anything, but so I could see her very easily, and correcting her brother when he was making a mistake in English, which I thought was rather amusing.
So the children were fluent in English as well, or at least
being taught that, yes.
Wow.
And also the interesting thing to me was that this seemed to be kind of contrary to my understanding of Japanese etiquette and how the families function. The father should be the boss, and but in this family, is obviously he was not quite that boss. And I finally figured it out after getting a little better acquainted with them. They were very nice people. But she came from an upper class family.
The wife did.
The wife did, and I imagine her family put up the money for the ink factory and so forth, and he was really had his career made for him by his in-laws.
Right.
And so therefore over there money count just like it does here.
So what you saw was an example of, despite the great contrast in the two societies, there were some similarities.
Oh yes, absolutely.
You saw that. Would you, as far as your other encounters with Japanese, Keith, do you think the Japanese civilian population as a whole received you as the victors, or was there a resentment? Did you feel any resentment from the Japanese civilian population?
No, I did not. Well, on occasions I had, but not very much. Okay. But the Japanese were just treated us as though this was a normal situation. For instance, when we first landed in Yokohama, they took our Jeep off, and the colonel, who's our G3, and myself, I was his assistant, drove all around the countryside by ourselves, and we were the first Americans to drive through the areas like that. And the women and children all go run and hide when they see us coming down in the Jeep. But the little boys, who incidentally all the adult men, including the little boys, had uniform on, at least as far as the jacket is concerned. And they looked at us respectfully, but no noise made or anything like that. And I could tell that sometimes the women would be looking out the windows, kind of behind curtains and that sort of thing, watching us going down. But a month or two later, we drive down the streets somewhere, and the children would be out on the streets following us, or waving at us and hollering chocolatto or cigaretto. And of course, the Japanese who were there training about etiquette and so forth, you'd give them some, we get rid of our tropical chocolate by giving it to the children. They loved it. We didn't think too much of it. And one old boy insisted on giving me postcards for it. He wasn't going to take anything for free. He was going to be an exchange. And this is typically Japanese. That was part of their culture.
Part of their sense of honor.
Right.
Or dignity. Yeah. Do you still have those postcards?
No, I still have them.
Oh my goodness, that's an incredible souvenir.
Yeah.
When you were there, did you have anything to do with disarming any soldiers that were based on the main islands?
Well, the way that was handled was we told them where to put the arms.
Right.
And we got lists and so forth of what they had, and we would then send a detail of men over there to check it out and make sure that it was as stated. And I really didn't have too much to do with that. I had more to do with the quartering of our own troops and getting them set up, and the others who went on and did the other work. But
as part of your G3.
Right. Cool. Okay. But I found the Japanese pretty cooperative. But I also feel that, underneath, they weren't all that happy about it. For instance, one of the people I met through my interpreter, had a son who was about to go to college, and I asked him about his son's education. He's going to an imperial college, and he wanted to be in the Navy. So I mean, you know, that they still had that sort of thing in mind. And when I went through the Parliament building, they had some mahogany in there, and they claimed how the Parliament building, everything was made out of material from Japan. I said, what part of Japan did the mahogany come from? And they said Formosa, which of course is a Chinese island which they occupied. So
they still saw that as belonging to Japan.
That's right. So that's
interesting.
But they were very cooperative, and apparently when their leaders, and starting with the emperor, told them that they're to cooperate, they cooperated, and he really is remarkably well. No riots that I'm aware of or anything like that.
Did you ever see the emperor?
No, I did not. No, I went to the Daiichi building quite often, right across from the Emperor Palace area there, so that if he'd been out and around, I probably could have seen him, but they had big walls and things around the premises and didn't see him. There's a rather interesting thing about MacArthur was that he understood the Far Eastern psychology a great deal. He was very good on that sort of thing. And for instance, in the Philippines, when he came ashore to visit us in Cebu Island, our division and others, there was a great deal of fanfare and a big show put on there because the Filipinos like that, and that impresses them. Mm-hmm. But in Japan, when he came from his quarters down to his office, which is in the Daiichi building, why, he just had a driver and himself. And the Japanese would gather around to watch him come in or go out, and they were very much impressed by the fact that he didn't show all this power and everything that they usually expected from their leaders. That impressed them. Mm-hmm. At least that's my...
It made him stand apart.
Yeah, right, right.
So did you ever see MacArthur when you were on the main island there?
No, I didn't. No, I got close to him, and he's near, in offices near where I was and all that, but I just didn't happen to see him.
Okay. All right, so you were in Japan for about three and a half months.
Right, and then when they shipped us back, our deactivation as a division took place in the state of Washington.
Okay.
And of course, I was just given orders when we got back to Fort Lawson, outside of Seattle. Why I got orders shipped me back to Camp Devens in Massachusetts. Okay. I was actually discharged from Camp Evans. The one thing that I noticed, which rubbed me right away when I got home from the Japan, is how rude and rough and disrespectful Americans were to soldiers coming back like ourselves, and it was so different from the way we were being treated in Japan.
You don't feel that they treated you with the respect you deserved, or as heroes, or? Well,
I wasn't expecting the hero part, but I was expecting a little respect anyhow, just what I think people should show each other, period, regardless of whether... I wasn't thinking of the hero part so much, but for instance, if you had a little trouble getting on the bus or anything, the bus driver is just, you know, he'd swear at you or be as disagreeable as he wanted to be, as he was to everybody else. I mean, we weren't treated any different than anybody else,
right.
Which I guess is all right, but you're just... it's something that impressed me very much right away like that.
Well, it's interesting because some Korean War veterans have commented that when they came home, that people were more interested in watching I Love Lucy on TV than in welcoming back men who had made such sacrifices.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that you make that comment. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you returned to Fort Evans in Massachusetts.
Right.
And take us from there. What did you do after?
My father came up and picked me up, okay, and brought me back to New Haven, so I stayed with my parents in New Haven. Okay. That's the first time I was kind of resident in New Haven since 1934. That is 11 years, because I went off to college and then I went off to war, and I never really lived at home at that. I practiced law in Cleveland a couple months before I went into the service. And I thought since I was married, the big problem for me would be to get a job. I didn't want to go into the military full time because I just didn't feel the infantry, and that was something I cared to make a career out of. But I figured that we still had a big problem unsolved with the Soviet Union, and so therefore I wanted to stay in the reserves and keep up my commission in good standing. And so, and also job hunting, I felt the important thing was to get established with a job because I had a wife to support now. Well, she wasn't over here yet. She was still trying to get a ride from New Zealand across to the Pacific to the United States and that sort of thing. And I say I got home the day before Christmas, at 45. But fortunately, by the middle of, well, maybe the 1st of February, they set up a bride boat, ship which would bring the brides over from New Zealand and Australia. And I think she came over with a ship that had about 10,000 brides on it. Wow. At San Francisco. And
did you meet her in San Francisco?
I did. I got my job at Connecticut Mutual by just calling around and different insurance companies to see what I could get in the way of a job. I tried the New Haven law firms and didn't find much interest in me there. Of course, I was a member of the Ohio bar and not Connecticut, but I had no problem becoming a member of the Connecticut bar. And with the insurance companies, I finally found one that was interested, and they hired me. I spent the next 36 years working for that company, Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company. Meanwhile, I kept my active reserve commission, and it went for 2 weeks training or whatever camp they offered in the summers and that sort of thing for the first few years. But my wife got on this bride ship in February, and on March 4th, 1946, she landed in San Francisco. And there was another man at Connecticut Mutual who was actually going to work in an office in Dallas, but he was at the time in the home office for working for a few weeks, who was also in the service, had a New Zealand wife coming over in the same ship. And he bought a new car, and so he said, let's drive out there and get him, so we did.
So you drove all the way across the United States?
Yeah, right. To pick up our wives. We went through Los Angeles and then up to San Francisco March 4th and met the ship, and we drove back together as far as Oklahoma City. And he had to go down to Texas to his new job that he's working still with our company, and his wife. And we found, interestingly enough, that his wife's family knew Alexis's family. New Zealanders seem to know each other a lot like that. That's not unusual. And we left them there and flew up to Chicago and then took the train to Detroit. Of course, my grandmother had died in Ann Arbor in September of '45, so I didn't see her, but I saw my aunts and uncles. And we actually stayed in Toledo, which is Alexis's aunt and uncle. Her mother's sister had married an American, and they lived in Toledo, so that's where we made our headquarters and drove up to Ann Arbor and Detroit for our visits. It was a couple of days, and then we got back to New Haven, and I had to then find a place for us to live in Hartford, and we got a 2-room apartment. Well, we got a 1-room apartment first up there, and it was on Farmington Avenue, the corner of Laurel in Farmington. And we were upstairs on the 3rd floor, a furnished apartment, so-called. It really had 2 rooms in it, and it was awfully small, and it was furnished, because we didn't have any furniture or anything yet at this point. And there's pressers cleaners downstairs that ran a business on the first floor. Every time they ran that press, it would shake the building. So the dishes we had on the shelves that would shake in our apartment.
Is that building still there?
No, it's gone. And it was as quickly as we could. We found that there was an apartment. They had rent control doing in the 1946 when I first got back. So you had to deal with the question of rent control and so forth. But we found a couple in a building on the corner of Laurel, on the corner of Imlay Street in Farmington, which was a converted townhouses. And this couple said they'd lease their place to us. We could take their lease over from them. So we took it over from them and found that we hadn't followed the proper procedure, and the landlord was just mattering hops about it. But he finally backed off and let us stay there. But so we had a two-room apartment there, which would last until 1948, which is almost 2 years. Mm-hmm. And we bought a house on the corner of Gillette Street and Niles Street, and that was a 13-room house with 9 fireplaces and
9 fireplaces.
Right. It was a real old Victorian house, and it had been the home of some prominent person before when it was built. But each time it changed hands, it went down the level a bit. The person we bought it from was a retired professor at the Hartford Seminary.
Is it still there now?
He was still in the house, yeah. He sold it to us, and then we moved in there. That would, of course, be quite a heavy expense on our part to carry a house with the taxes and so forth. So we rented the 3rd floor out, mm-hmm. and even a little bit of the 2nd floor. We could do it and mm-hmm. furnish it otherwise ourselves.
Is that house still there?
No, that house is gone too. Yeah, it's an apartment there.
Huh.
And we lived there till 68, and in fact, all our children were born while we were.
While you were living?
Well, our oldest was born before we got there. The other 3 were born while we were in that house. Uh-huh. And then we moved up to, well, anyhow, we moved up to Kenyon Street for a while, and then to Glastonbury.
Okay. Obviously, you were a lawyer before your days in the service.
Right.
So did you continue your education in any way after the war? Did you use the GI Bill in any way, or?
No, I really didn't.
You didn't need to, I guess.
I would like to have used it, but to change my career, but that didn't fit our financial situation, and so I just gave that up. I mean, I would have gone into studying international law and that sort of thing. And I had some encouragement by people who were in the field, mm-hmm. but I felt the family responsibilities were such that I couldn't afford to do that.
So you remained a lawyer for Columbia, Connecticut Mutual,
right?
Until you retired.
Right, until 1982 when I retired. Yeah.
Retired in 1982. One thing that you've commented before on off camera are some of the friendships you made in the service. For instance, your Filipino scout.
Yeah.
So, could you tell us maybe about some of the closest friendships you made in the service, and about how you may have continued them after the war?
Yeah.
Please?
Well, obviously you get very close to the other officers or men that are with you in the local units. For instance, there was a fellow by the name of Fred Reynolds who came over and joined us in Hawaii, and in fact when we were fighting up on New Georgia, he was about 20 or 30 yards from me when the Japanese opened fire on us, and he got shot in the face and I don't know other parts, but had half his face shot off. Oh. And we carried him back, and this was way up on the Zieta Trail, and we got him carried up by, they had to hand carry him. There's no jeeps got up into where we were. There were a couple miles, so they got to the jeep road, and then they got him into the jeep, took him down to Munda and flew him off to the hospital, and I thought that's the last we'd ever see of him. It just looked awful with the half the face is off, just including the nose and part of the mouth and jaw and so forth. And also he got hit in the rear and his finger or something or other also. But that was the most serious part of it. He survived that. And the General Hospital at Valley Forge, I think, was able to reconstruct that, and so that he got a job with an insurance company, a different one in Hartford, and lived across the street from us on Farmington Avenue.
Oh my goodness.
And so when we came there and settled down, we became close friends with him and his wife, and they had some children, and they were lifetime friends. Another man who was with me in the first company I was assigned to, in the Company I, in the 35th Infantry Division, a regiment rather, in the division. His name was Jonas Height, and he was a very close friend of mine. I liked him a lot. He was from Mississippi, and was an engineer, and worked for a company in Virginia which was manufacturing explosives or something or other. It must have been something like DuPont before he got into the service. And he had a very good sense of humor, and used to like to write poetry, little driblets and so forth of things. And I kept, even when I got assigned to another regiment or another battalion and so forth, I always kept tabs with him. But he was killed up on Luzon, and I had felt that, well, he was not married, and I could just see that he was one of those people who's kind of indifferent whether he would get killed or not. You know, you have people like that in combat as well as other types and other attitudes. It wasn't that he was fearless or non-fearless or anything else. It didn't have anything to do with that. It just had to do with a certain indifference. Then I've had other good friends. The Filipino scout that I had assigned to me when I was company commander in the Cebu Island and Negros, when I came down from being company commander, was sitting around regimental headquarters for a few days. It was a hometown, Dumaguete, where my scout Jose Laspinas lived, and he cooked me some banana fritters, which were made with coconut oil. However, that was a little rough for me, but I appreciated his efforts. But he and I kept contact for a long time. He was an artist and a musician. He had a jazz band, and he wanted me to get him music from the U.S. for him, which I did, and sent it over to him after the war, and we kind of kept tabs of it. He finally immigrated to Australia. I tried to help him get into the United States, which he should have, and he certainly was entitled to it, but it seemed it was impossible to put together the papers and things. One of the things I found out later was that they had a fire in St. Louis where a lot of the records got burned up from the Pacific War.
This was around 1970 or so.
Yeah, right. And so that a lot of the records you just didn't have. And anyhow, he never got to this country, but he went to Australia and did portrait painting in Sydney for a while. Then our correspondence kind of slipped away, and I don't know, I think he must have gone back to the Philippines, because I just didn't get any correspondence from him. Then there were other officers and men that I kept track of also, and were personal friends.
It's true that obviously you've kept in touch to some degree with the family of Medal of Honor recipient Charles Davis.
Oh yeah.
And that you just have heard from his son after Mr. Davis was honored at the, where was it in Kansas?
The chief of staff, command and staff school at Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth.
And you actually almost went out to attend that ceremony, but his son sent you a video recording of
He did do that, yes, right.
So you have kept in touch with a number of people and kept that thread going,
right.
And that's obviously deeply satisfying for you. Did you belong to any veterans organizations after the war?
Not right away, but eventually I wanted to join the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I haven't been too active as an organizational type of thing, but they were very helpful in getting my father into Rocky Hill at Veterans Home.
So you've had some intermittent involvement with the VFW,
yeah, right.
At least have been a member.
Yeah, and before that I did go back to the 25th Infantry Division or Marical Division reunions and so forth. And my old company commander on Guadalcanal, that is someone who I'm still friendly with, he still lives up in North Dakota.
Really?
And
how old is he? Is he in his 90s as well? Or?
Well, he's about my age. He's that's the interesting thing about age in business. I was kind of an old second lieutenant when I went in overseas because I was inactive because I couldn't pass a physical before the war. But then they waived it, and but I still second lieutenant, even though I'd qualified for first lieutenant, and these other people had. If I had gone through the other cycle, I would have probably ended up a first lieutenant or captain overseas somewhere, and I'd have a different kind of job and experience than what I had.
Okay. Well, we've talked about your career after the war. You were an attorney for Connecticut Mutual. So I'm going to ask in conclusion a few basic questions about your experience and how those experiences contributed to your perspective on life and on not only on the military rather, but on life in general. Would you say that your military experience influenced your thinking in general about the war and about the military? Tell me how it affected your opinion of war and of the military.
Well, obviously, I don't like war, and I would think that I would be much more careful about getting into a war if I was a leader of the country, of having that experience and beforehand, before the war. And I was very fond of history and European history. I used to think Napoleon was a great story, and Frederick the Great was a great story, and I liked them very much. I never thought about the suffering and casualties and the things in wars when I did that. But when I went into service and then into combat in Guadalcanal and these other places, I not only have to think about my own life or death, but the question of killing other people and that sort of thing, and the damage and all that. I just found that I had never thought about that when I hadn't put the theoretical history, so to speak, together with the actual experience of people who were doing the fighting and the rest of it.
Makes war less glamorous.
Sure, it's very much less glamorous. I think it helped me, I should say helped me, but it made me be in favor of civil defense and defenses against nuclear war. And when they were, Eisenhower had undertaken programs for that in the 1950s, and I got a fallout shelter in our high school, which I think is probably one of the few high schools in the country that had that, but that's because that's what I believed in, and I thought it didn't cost much more to put the shelter in than otherwise, and you pay for insurance and so forth. This is a kind of insurance for life, and I would say that I am really more against war now than I have ever been, because I see what's happening. But it all depends upon circumstances, and I feel the big problem that's come to this country the last 40, 50 years is that we consider ourselves a world power and leader, and we try to arrange things way over areas where we really don't have much knowledge of from a cultural standpoint, and knowing people and the way they live and the rest of it, and that we should have. And secondly, we're not showing the respect that we should have for other people's ways of life. And I think part of that is the fact that we as a society are a consuming society. For instance, in the 1960s, which is still quite a while back from now, when I went to the War College and was studying resources, I found that we were using, at 5% of the world population, we were using 50% of certain materials and metals and various other things, and we had our living standard really was a little bit living off other people's resources and so forth, which is perhaps not really that fortunate. And I think we lost our modesty about things, and should have been able to step back a little bit. But I think our people do recognize that quite a bit, but we still haven't been able to manage our foreign policy today in such a way that we're not over involving ourselves in details in far countries which really we could get along with the other countries around there do it. I think the United Nations idea is excellent, and while it doesn't function efficiently or anything, it does function and does bring people together and does cause discussions, and I think it is. So
that's a positive legacy of World War II, is the United Nations.
Yeah, right.
Well, how would you say your service and experiences affected your life? You've already, to some degree, touched upon that in terms of your worldview.
Yeah.
But how would you say it affected your day-to-day life here in the United States? Did it help you appreciate things more? Did it give you a better sense of patience? Would you have any comments to make there?
Well, I think it makes me a lot slower in getting into situations which were controversial, which could lead to conflict. I won't say that this war completely affected this, but I became president of the Hartford Board of Education at a time when integration was at its peak. And as a matter of fact, I was invited to a meeting which the black community had Martin Luther King at the Bushnell, and I sat up on the stage with him and some others, and several other people, but I was the only white person invited up there, except I asked him also to invite Louis Fox, who was I felt deserved to be recognized. So he and I were the only two white people that were participating in the program. The audience was just about 100% black. And it was also I tried to work with the leaders in the North End so that when the time that Luther was assassinated, and he had riots in some cities and places, why in Hartford you didn't have any going down, students mobbing stores and breaking windows and stuff, because we had already brought in some establishment, not some establishment, but some black leadership into our high schools and so forth, even though we couldn't do it on a straight structural basis because of the requirements of educational qualifications and things. We found ways around that, and that paid off for us because we had no riots after that, except students going out and being excited and that sort of thing. I was president of the school board at the time. We called it holiday the next day in mourning, of course. I feel my military experience has certainly influenced me in my thinking on how to deal with things.
How to deal with conflicts and to
Yeah,
resolve.
right.
Okay, well, would you like to say anything else in closing, Keith? This has been a great, epic interview, and you've covered a great deal, and it's most appreciated. If there's anything else you might like to say in conclusion.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time and getting this down for posterity, because it probably might not get there otherwise. And it's I think people should know about what's other people's experiences, and they should be available somewhere sometime. I think they will be. So I understand that there's going to be thousands of these available in this collection, and I think that is just wonderful for the future of the country to have that. It's going to be a resource for families when they're checking up on somebody and they want to find out about their roots and so forth. That'll be available to them. I think it's just great, and I congratulate you.
Well, I congratulate you for all your great life achievements, and thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great.